Do you think Rome was invincible? The Roman Empire conquered vast lands, defeated powerful armies, and imposed its will on entire nations. But what if I told you that an African civilization not only resisted Rome, but made it retreat in humiliation? The Kingdom of Kush, a forgotten power, proved that even Rome wasn't unbeatable. How did a smaller army achieve the impossible? What strategy brought down the greatest power of the ancient world? Stay until the end to discover how the warriors of Kush wrote one of the most humiliating chapters in Roman history. Rome, the eternal city, was at the height of its power. Its empire stretched from one horizon to the other, spanning across Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor, and no nations dared challenge its authority. The Roman legions, disciplined and relentless, marched without rest, subjugating peoples and assimilating cultures. The Romans, with their roads and fortresses, were the undisputed masters of a world that seemed limitless to their ambition. In the minds of the Romans, there was no place strong enough to resist the supremacy of their empire. Indeed, Rome believed that its greatness was eternal, and the victories won in previous battles had solidified the idea that there was no obstacle that couldn't be overcome. When a new conquest was at stake, their commanders were confident that the only question was how quickly the victory would come. But like every story of greatness, what seemed unbeatable had its own limits, and those limits were about to be tested in a surprising way. Imperial Rome was so absorbed by its triumphs in Europe and the eastern provinces that the threat came from the south, from a region considered peripheral and distant, the Kingdom of Kush, south of Egypt. Kush, an ancient and mysterious kingdom, lay on the banks of the Nile, in a land marked by scorching deserts and imposing mountains. The Romans knew little about the inhabitants of this region, whose warriors and combat tactics were beyond their certainty. The Kushites, as they were known, lived in a harsh and hot land, but where the strength of will and the warrior spirit of their people were even more imposing. The relationship between Rome and Kush had never been of great significance. Rome, as always, coveted wealth and resources, and it was with this imperialistic spirit that they decided to impose heavy tributes on the African region. In their view, the Kushites were a people of little worth, and their kingdom, isolated, was not worthy of attention. For Rome, it was just a matter of time before domination over these lands would be secured. However, the Roman Empire made the classic mistake of underestimation. By ignoring the potential resistance of Kush and its organizational capabilities, Rome allowed a silent force to prepare for a confrontation. The people of Kush not only resisted oppression, but also secretly grew stronger, preparing for the right moment to challenge the greatest power of the ancient world. And when Rome least expected it, the wind blowing from the desert brought the storm. In 24 BC, a devastating attack caught the Romans completely off guard. A Kushite army, led by one of the most iconic figures in history, Queen Candace, advanced without warning through the Egyptian borders, defying Roman supremacy, and in the blink of an eye, turning a war that seemed certain into a nightmare for the empire. The Romans, accustomed to triumph, found themselves powerless against an enemy they had never considered a real threat. The invasion of Kush was not just a military battle, but a direct affront to Roman pride. The humiliation began to spread, and the confidence that Rome had in its invincibility started to crumble. What seemed like a simple challenge turned into a fight for imperial survival, and the history of the Roman Empire would never be the same. The Kingdom of Kush, hidden in the southern regions of Egypt, was a civilization as ancient as the Nile itself. Though far from the major power circles that dominated the Mediterranean, the kingdom had a culture, a history, and a military strength that rivaled any of the great powers of the time. The hot and arid land of Kush forged a strong and resilient people, whose combat skills were closely tied to their adaptation to the desert and the mountains surrounding their home. Kush's capital, Meroe, was a vibrant center of trade and power, famous for its towering pyramids and temples dedicated to ancestral gods. But what truly defined the Kingdom of Kush was not just its wealth or its impressive architecture, but its spirit of resistance and the strength of its leaders. The lands of Kush were ruled by a lineage of monarchs known as the Candace Queens, women with absolute authority, who possessed remarkable strategic skills and leadership that inspired unshakable courage in their subjects. Unlike Roman rulers, who often viewed their subjects as mere pieces of an expanding empire, the Candaces were revered and feared figures. They led their armies into battle with skill and were experts in guerrilla tactics, using the harsh terrain and weather conditions to their advantage. Under Candace's command, the warriors of Kush became more than just an army. They became a force that, when provoked, would react with a ferocity that Rome did not expect. Queen Candace was not just a strategist, but also a woman of unwavering courage. Her ability to unite different tribes and factions under a single banner made her a formidable leader, capable of making ordinary men feel invincible under her leadership. Her reign was marked by justice and the protection of her people, and she had become a symbol of resistance against both the Egyptians and anyone who dared underestimate her strength. When Rome decided to impose heavy tributes on Kush, Candace did not bow. On the contrary, she began to gather forces, train her warriors, and strengthen her defenses, knowing that the confrontation with Rome was inevitable. The Kushite army, though smaller in number than the Roman Empire, had a crucial advantage. They knew the terrain like no one else. Their troops were skilled in quick and stealthy maneuvers, taking advantage of the difficult geography to ambush and surprise the Romans, who, used to fighting on open and organized fields, were not prepared for desert warfare. Moreover, the harsh climate of North Africa, with its relentless heat and water scarcity, posed an obstacle to the Romans, while the Kushite warriors, accustomed to these extreme conditions, maintained a significant tactical advantage. Kush, despite its isolation, was a rising power. Its trade in gold, ivory, and other valuable resources was already starting to attract attention, and its well-developed military tactics made the kingdom a respected adversary. However, Rome's greatest mistake was to view Kush as a lesser civilization, something that could never, in any way, threaten Roman dominance. They didn't know that, in secret, the African kingdom was preparing to prove the opposite, and that the real challenge to Rome would come from a place they barely considered. When Candace decided it was time to fight Rome, it was not by whim, but by necessity. The people of Kush were tired of being oppressed, of paying heavy tributes that weakened their economy and resources. What had been considered a peripheral kingdom was about to become one of the greatest challenges in Roman military history. The Roman humiliation was about to be written in the sands of the African desert, and the most powerful empire in the world would be forced to face an adversary of unforeseen resistance. After the famous defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Rome wasted no time in consolidating its presence in Egypt, annexing it as a province under the Roman Empire. The great Egyptian civilization, with its pyramids and temples, was reduced to just another piece in Rome's vast board of conquests. For the Romans, the annexation of Egypt was a strategic move, as the region was vital for their sustenance. More than anything else, Egypt was the empire's granary, providing grain that fed not only the Roman cities, but the entire army spread across the empire. Under Roman rule, Egypt transformed into a supply center, a repository of essential resources for the continuation of Roman expansion. The vast plains of Egypt were farmed by Egyptian peasants, now under the control of an empire that imposed exorbitant taxes and controlled food production with an iron fist. Rome, in its relentless quest for wealth and power, knew that without Egypt's grain, the Roman Empire would begin to feel the effects of weakening. The economy depended on the abundance of Egyptian harvests, and control over the Nile was, for Rome, the key to the survival of its empire. However, the absorption of Egypt by Rome was not a simple process. The Egyptian people, even after the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty, never truly felt submissive to the Romans. Although the Romans tried, through governors and administrators, to maintain control over the region, Egyptian culture continued to serve as an element of silent resistance. The wealth of Alexandria, the empire's most important port city, flowed into Rome, but Egyptian spirituality and cultural pride still echoed throughout the land. Thus, Egypt was under Roman rule, but the empire did not fully understand the deep discontent simmering in the shadows. Formal submission did not mean true acceptance, and the land of the pharaohs was not willing to give up everything it had without resistance. However, over time, Roman control seemed assured, as Rome's legions were ready to use military force to maintain order. The invasion of a distant people, such as the Kingdom of Kush, was far from the Roman mind. They believed Egypt was entirely under their control, unaware that their oppressive actions and relentless demand for resources were creating fertile ground for a revolt no one had anticipated. However, Rome did not know that, despite its formal control over Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush to the south was becoming a real threat, and that resistance would begin to emerge from the least expected place. The Roman Empire began to realize that military force alone was not enough to maintain dominance over all the lands it had conquered. Egypt, with its vital importance to the empire, would become the starting point for a conflict that would later be known as the invasion of Kush. While Rome consolidated its empire in vast regions, with its legions busy expanding borders in Europe and the East, little attention was paid to the southern part of the empire. The Egyptian border, which extended to the Kingdom of Kush, appeared peaceful, and the Romans, absorbed by the larger and more obvious challenges in other parts of the empire, neglected this strategic area. The Romans, so confident in the invincibility of their legions and their control over Egypt, failed to realize they were leaving a dangerous gap. The distance, harsh climate conditions, and the relative lack of precise information about the Kingdom of Kush led the Romans to view the region as a peripheral and strategically insignificant part of the empire. The war in the north, campaigns in Gaul, the fight to preserve the Pax Romana, and internal conflicts with other Roman factions consumed the attention of their commanders. As a result, military resources on the southern frontier were scarce, and the Roman legions patrolling the region were insufficient to effectively control the territory. This neglect allowed the Kingdom of Kush, a previously underestimated enemy, to begin strengthening. The African kingdom, recognizing the lack of Roman intervention and the tranquility along the Egyptian border, began to organize itself. Candace, the Queen of Kush, took advantage of this freedom to gather her forces. Without the constant pressure of a Roman military presence in the south, the warriors of Kush began preparing for an attack with strategic vision and courage based on their deep knowledge of the terrain, the difficulties faced by the Roman army in the desert, and the pride of their independence. Rome's inaction, its blind confidence that the south was secure, became the catalyst for revolt. By neglecting the southern border, the Romans gave Candace the opportunity to reorganize, recruit more soldiers, and arm her army with an intensity that Rome could not foresee. And so, what seemed like a safe distance between Rome and Kush turned into a battleground where the story of a Roman humiliation would begin to unfold. While Rome dealt with its internal problems and the complex campaigns in the north, the Kingdom of Kush thrived under the leadership of a queen determined to restore dignity to her people and land. The lack of a strong military presence along the Roman borders, coupled with an overconfidence in its strength, not only caused Rome to lose control over the region, but also underestimated the growing power of its enemy. When Rome finally realized its mistake, it was too late. The storm of Kush was about to descend upon them. When the Roman Senate decided to appoint Gaius Cornelius Gallus as governor of Egypt, the empire expected him to be a strong leader capable of maintaining control over the newly annexed province. However, Gallus was not the commanding figure needed to ensure the region's stability. Although he had grand personal ambitions, his administrative and military skills were questionable, and he soon showed more interest in gaining fame for himself than fulfilling Rome's mission. Gallus' true weakness was his inability to perceive what was happening around him. While the Romans focused on other parts of the empire, Gallus indulged in luxury and status instead of reinforcing defenses and ensuring the region's safety against external threats. He believed that Egypt's stability was guaranteed by the mere Roman presence, unaware that the Kingdom of Kush to the south was growing stronger each day. Gallus was also influenced by his own vanity. Instead of prioritizing diplomacy with the Egyptians and neighboring peoples, he sought to impose his authority in an authoritarian manner, which caused resentment among the locals. His arrogant attitude alienated not only the inhabitants of Egypt, but also the Roman soldiers under his command. Rather than building strong alliances and fortifying the southern border, Gallus sought ways to impress Rome, pursuing conquests that reflected positively on him without considering the empire's real security needs. His greatest failure, however, was his underestimation of the growing threat from Kush. Instead of sending forces to monitor the military activity of the African kingdom or reinforcing the fortresses along the Egyptian border, he neglected the area, believing that the Roman legions would be more than sufficient to suppress any attempts at rebellion. When the Kingdom of Kush, led by the shrewd Queen Candace, began to organize, Gallus was completely unprepared to react. This neglect had devastating consequences. When the Kushite forces invaded Egypt, the Romans were caught off guard and disorganized. The fortresses were poorly equipped, and the legions under Gallus' command were poorly positioned, unable to respond effectively. Gallus, realizing the magnitude of his error, attempted to respond with force, but the disaster was already in motion. The Kushite army, motivated and well-trained, quickly took key cities and wreaked havoc on Roman supply lines. When the situation became untenable, Gallus himself saw his command collapse. His mistakes and his inability to deal with the crisis were fatal. He was removed from his post by Augustus, the Roman emperor, who did not tolerate such failures. To avoid a larger scandal and a negative effect on Roman morale, Gallus was forced to commit suicide. His death reflected the gravity of his incompetence and how he had jeopardized the integrity of the Roman Empire. Gallus' fall was not just a personal failure, but a reflection of how Rome was becoming complacent and unprepared to face new challenges. His failure to protect Egypt and monitor the Kingdom of Kush revealed a fragility in the empire's foundations, which was about to be profoundly shaken by the unexpected strength of an African enemy. Rome, in its immense confidence in its military and political power, viewed the lands south of Egypt as distant territory and therefore insignificant. The Kingdom of Kush, though it had its own history and greatness, was not seen as a real threat. The Romans, with their focus on dominating Europe and Asia, believed that the vast distances and geographical difficulties between Egypt and Kush were sufficient barriers to prevent any serious challenge to Roman domination. Kush, in the Roman mind, was seen as just an isolated kingdom, without significant military forces and an economy dependent on its crops and local trade. They viewed the region as a peripheral area, far from the centers of Roman power, and therefore believed they could crush any resistance easily, without the need for large mobilizations or elaborate strategies. It was this underestimation that created space for a rebellion that Rome could not foresee. The Roman Empire believed its armies, mostly unbeatable, and its network of fortresses and garrisons along the borders were enough to keep any region under control. However, with no strong military presence in the south, the Kingdom of Kush began reorganizing without Roman interference. Its population, tired of the heavy taxes imposed by the Romans and the economic exploitation, began to prepare for an inevitable confrontation. The leadership of Candace, Queen of Kush, was a decisive factor in the game-changing turn. Contrary to what Rome believed, she was not a weak or unprepared monarch, but a shrewd strategist, capable of rallying her people and forces in a surprising manner. Under her leadership, Kush not only organized a strong and well-trained army, but also exploited the African terrain in ways the Romans, with their lack of knowledge and underestimation of the enemy, could not comprehend. Roman confidence in their past victories, especially in their successful military campaigns against European and Eastern peoples, made Roman commanders look south with disdain. When Candace and her army began launching sporadic attacks against Roman fortresses in Egypt, Rome failed to realize that a major offensive was about to occur. The Romans did not foresee that the small kingdom of Kush, so underestimated, could unite its forces, fight with such determination, and organize itself so effectively. This misjudgment led to total surprise when in 24 BC, the Kushite army invaded Egypt with full force. Rome, which had believed it was in total control of the region, suddenly found itself powerless before an enemy it had ignored and underestimated for years. Rome's belief in its own invincibility, which had been the foundation of its empire, was deeply shaken. Therefore, underestimating the Kingdom of Kush was not only a strategic miscalculation, but also a reflection of the arrogance and complacency of an empire that believed it was invincible. And when the Kushite invasion took Egypt by surprise, Rome was forced to rethink its foreign policy and the way it approached the peripheral regions of the empire, especially those that, at first glance, seemed harmless. When the Roman Empire imposed heavy tributes on the Kingdom of Kush, believing the region would be an easy source of resources, little did Rome know that it was awakening the fury of a great leader. Candace, Queen of Kush, was not only a ruler concerned with the prosperity of her kingdom, but also a relentless strategist, whose cunning and determination would make Rome pay dearly for its arrogance. Faced with the growing pressure from Rome, Candace did not succumb to fear or submission. On the contrary, she saw oppression as an opportunity to unite her people and strengthen her position. Well aware of the value of independence and the importance of maintaining the freedom of her people, Candace knew that war with Rome was inevitable, but at the same time, she knew that victory would only be possible with careful planning and strategic mobilization. With her inspiring leadership, she called a meeting of tribal and military leaders from Kush, aiming to create a coalition of united forces. It was not just the regular Kushite army being mobilized, but also neighboring tribes whose warriors were loyal to her cause. She knew that victory against Rome would not depend solely on numbers, but on the ability to exploit the local terrain, using guerrilla strategies to exploit the weaknesses of the Roman legions. Candace also had the wisdom to build a network of espionage, sending emissaries to gather information on Roman movements and defenses. She knew that to defeat such a vast empire, she would need to be smart, not just brave. Her tactics were based on mobility and a deep understanding of the region, allowing her to strike with precision and disappear before the Romans had time to react. With the support of African tribes and her unified military strength, Candace prepared her army for what would become a decisive confrontation. Instead of following the Roman method of direct combat, Candace chose a more cunning approach, attacking the most vulnerable Roman fortresses, disrupting their supply lines, and causing disturbances in the Egyptian cities under Roman control. Her response to the Roman threat was not just military, but also psychological. Candace made the people of Kush see the conflict as a fight for survival, honor, and freedom. She became a symbol of resistance and courage, and her leadership inspired unwavering loyalty among her subjects. Thus, with a well-orchestrated plan and an unbreakable spirit, Candace began the fight against Roman oppression. She knew she would face a formidable military force, but her determination was even stronger. Her commitment to freedom and the future of her people not only challenged Rome, but also established the Kingdom of Kush as a power capable of standing up to the most powerful empire of the time. What Rome did not know was that the Queen of Kush was about to transform history, and her response to Roman tyranny would become one of the greatest lessons of resistance in the ancient world. In 24 BC, the tension between Rome and the Kingdom of Kush reached its boiling point. Candace, with her carefully planned strategy, finally took the decisive step. After months of preparations, espionage, and mobilization, the Kushite army was ready to act. They had infiltrated several regions and organized themselves with impressive discipline, adapting perfectly to the arid and inhospitable terrain of the African desert, where Rome was unprepared. Candace's force left Kush and advanced toward Egypt in a surprise attack. Rome, so confident in its control over the region, did not expect such an audacious offensive. When the Kushite troops crossed the border, many Romans believed they were just a sporadic force, not a serious threat. But soon, reality caught up with them. The Kushite army was not a disorganized group, but a cohesive force driven by fierce determination. The attack started with a bang. Candace's forces attacked the Roman fortresses along the Nile, catching the Romans off guard. The Roman garrisons, unprepared and scattered, were quickly overwhelmed. The Kushites, with their speed and guerrilla tactics, infiltrated the Egyptian cities under Roman control, destroying the symbols of imperial power. The fortresses fell like dominoes, one after the other, with no time for Rome to respond properly. The boldness of the attack went beyond expectations. Candace not only destroyed the Roman defenses, but also struck at the heart of Roman pride, their statues and monuments. When the Kushite army reached the city of Alexandria, where Roman control seemed strongest, the statue of Augustus was decapitated and taken as a war trophy. It was a direct affront to Rome's authority, a symbolic blow that would not go unnoticed. Rome, which had adorned its territories with statues and columns celebrating its emperors, now saw one of its greatest symbols being dishonored and taken far away, to a distant and unknown land. The capture of Egyptian cities and the destruction of their defenses were not mere military feats, but a true humiliation for Rome. The message was clear: the empire was not invincible, and it could not underestimate the peoples it had oppressed over the centuries. Egypt, with its strategic and economic importance, was being lost, and Roman pride was being broken before the audacity of an African queen. Candace, with her brilliant strategy and relentless leadership, had delivered a devastating blow to the Roman Empire. Unlike the traditional campaigns against Rome, where military strength decided everything, she had turned the war into something deeper, a struggle for honor, freedom, and resistance against tyranny. The Kushite attack shook Rome and forced the empire to reassess its position in Egypt and, more importantly, realize that its military superiority would not be enough to subjugate all nations that rose against it. This attack wouldn't just be another battle in the long history of the empire, but rather a turning point in the relationship between Rome and African peoples, and a reminder that, no matter how strong Rome was, its hegemony had limits. The invasion of Kush was not just a strategic shock to Rome, but a public humiliation that shook the very image of the empire. Egypt, one of Rome's jewels, was devastatingly and unexpectedly attacked. Important cities like Alexandria, once symbols of Roman power in the Eastern world, were being destroyed and looted by Candace's warriors. Rome could not ignore the impact of this. The humiliation of Rome began with the capture of key fortresses and the swift destruction of military posts along the Nile. The Roman garrisons, poorly prepared and ill-equipped, quickly succumbed to the speed and skill of the Kushite army. But the heaviest blow came when the Kushites managed to capture the city of Alexandria, Egypt's cultural and political center. There, Rome had placed much of its prestige. Alexandria was a symbol of its strength and control in the East, a showcase of imperial power, and its loss wasn't just a military defeat, but a psychological blow. The ultimate symbol of this humiliation was the capture of the statue of Augustus. The emperor, whose face adorned countless cities across the empire, revered as a god among his subjects, saw his own image stripped of its dignity. The statue of Augustus was decapitated and removed from the city, taken back to Kush as a trophy. This act wasn't just a simple military victory, but a direct mockery of Rome. What once represented the absolute power of the empire was transformed into a symbol of vulnerability and defeat. In imperial Rome, the loss of Alexandria and the destruction of its symbols was a scandal of gigantic proportions. The city had been a vital strategic, economic, and cultural center for the empire. Now, the idea that an African kingdom, so distant and underestimated, could defeat its military forces was a blow to its self-esteem. The Roman Empire, accustomed to crushing its enemies with ease, didn't know how to respond to such an audacious and unexpected threat. Rome wasn't used to being challenged on its own terms. For many Romans, what was happening wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield, but a challenge to their imperial identity. The image of Rome as an invincible power was being seriously shaken, and the Romans knew that in order to maintain their authority over the provinces, they needed to act swiftly to restore their image and strength. What Rome didn't foresee was Candace's persistence. She wasn't just fighting to defend her land, but to prove to the world that a nation united by courage and intelligence could defeat even the most powerful empire. Rome's humiliation wouldn't be easily forgotten. The repercussions of this event would reverberate throughout the empire, and the tension between Rome and Kush would reach a new peak. The Roman Empire, now touched by defeat, would have to decide what to do in the face of the growing threat of an adversary that should never have been underestimated. Rome's humiliation was deep and resonated throughout the empire. The blow suffered in Egypt could not be ignored, and the pressure on the Senate and on Augustus himself was mounting. Rome, challenged by a force as unexpected as the Kingdom of Kush, knew it needed to reassert its authority and, more importantly, its image as a dominant power. The response couldn't be delayed, and Rome knew that the only way to restore its honor was through military force. It was then that Emperor Augustus made a critical decision. He would send General Petronius, a veteran with vast knowledge of Eastern campaigns and the trust of the Roman legions. Petronius was tasked with leading an expedition to reverse the defeat and regain control of Egypt. Rome's army, though shaken, was still a formidable military machine, and with Petronius at the helm, Rome believed it could reclaim its position. The mission was clear: to crush the Kushite rebellion and restore Roman order. Petronius didn't hesitate to take on the responsibility. He set out with an army of 10,000 soldiers, confident in their numerical superiority and military experience. Upon reaching Egypt, his first priority was to reorganize the Roman forces and stabilize the region. Petronius' plan was simple: cut off Kush's supply lines and strike a decisive blow against Candace's army. Petronius' expedition represented an attempt to rebuild Rome's confidence, but it was also a risk. Rome, already low in morale after the defeat, knew that another failure would be catastrophic. Petronius was aware that if he didn't turn the situation around quickly, Roman humiliation could deepen even further, compromising Augustus' authority and the stability of the empire. However, Petronius' mission wouldn't be easy. Though he was an experienced leader, he would face the difficulties of African terrain, the extreme conditions of the desert, and the adaptability of the Kushite forces. Candace's army, accustomed to the land and specialized in guerrilla tactics, would not be easily defeated. But Rome's pride was at stake, and Petronius knew he could not fail. The march to the heart of Egypt had only just begun, and the Romans, armed with their organizational superiority, were ready to face Candace's fury in a decisive battle that could determine the fate of the empire in the east. However, as with any great military expedition, overconfidence in an easy victory could be a fatal mistake. Rome didn't fully know the determination and ingenuity of the Kushites. The war was far from decided, and Petronius knew that while it was an inevitable response, Rome's future in Egypt was still up for grabs. The tension was palpable, and the next move from both sides would be crucial. Petronius' expedition to Egypt was a colossal effort, and his first major test of strategy was taking the city of Penis, a key point for the supply routes sustaining Candace's army. The city was well defended, but the Romans were determined to turn the situation around and secure control of the main transportation routes feeding the Kushite army. Petronius knew that in order to win, he would need to block Kush's access to supplies and cut off their communication lines. So, he focused his efforts on capturing Penis, expecting that this would weaken Candace's resistance and force the Kushites to retreat. The Romans surrounded the city with precision, using their military discipline and superior tactical skills, which had always been their hallmark. The siege of Penis was a test of endurance. The city, though not heavily walled, was protected by difficult terrain and a garrison of well-trained soldiers accustomed to the harsh conditions of the region. Petronius, however, was undeterred. He ordered continuous attacks, alternating between direct approaches and tactics of attrition, using his archers, engineers, and heavy infantry units to weaken the defenders. After days of intense fighting, the city of Penis finally fell. The victory, though significant, came at a cost. The scorching heat, diseases, and logistical difficulties had taken a toll on the Roman troops, and the losses were considerable. However, the capture of Penis represented a crucial strategic victory. Petronius knew that by disrupting the supply routes, he would force Candace to reassess her options and reconsider her tactics. With the city under Roman control, Petronius prepared to take the next step. He knew that although this victory was significant, the war was far from decided. The Kushite army was still out there, scattered across the vast and arid plains, ready to strike again. Despite the victory, the Roman forces were still far from unbeatable. Therefore, Petronius did not allow complacency to take hold of his expedition. With Penis under control, he began planning his next move, to advance deeper into Kushite territory, hoping to force Candace into a decisive confrontation. But he also knew that the Kushite army was strong and determined, and the war was far from over. The victory at Penis represented just one step in the long journey of restoring Roman prestige in Egypt. The real battle, undoubtedly, was still ahead. Meanwhile, in Kush, Candace carefully observed Petronius's movements. She knew that Rome's victory at Penis was just a temporary win, a strategy to weaken her army. But her confidence remained unshaken. She believed that the Roman Empire was underestimating her people's resistance, and that, despite the challenges, Kush still had much to offer in the fight. The war continued, and the fate of both empires was far from decided. After the capture of Penis, the Roman army seemed to have gained a significant strategic advantage, but the difficulties that Petronius and his troops faced in the vast and inhospitable regions of the African desert began to become clear. The victory at Penis had not solved all the problems. Quite the opposite. The terrain conditions, combined with the relentless heat and lack of resources, began to severely affect the Roman forces. The desert was an invisible enemy, more difficult to fight than any Kushite soldier. The Roman troops were used to the rigors of combat, but nothing had prepared them for the arid and harsh desert environment. The intense heat during the day, reaching unbearable extremes, drained the soldiers' strength. The risk of dehydration was constant, and water sources were scarce, forcing the Romans to ration their resources with military precision. Moreover, diseases began to spread among the troops. Without the infrastructure and medical care that Rome usually had in the more developed regions of the empire, soldiers quickly succumbed to fevers and infections, further weakening the Roman army. Health conditions became an increasing concern for Petronius, who watched his men collapse one by one. Morale, already shaken by the previous defeat and the fierce resistance of Candace, began to plummet even further. As the Roman forces struggled to survive in the harsh desert conditions, the Kushite army held the advantage. The Kushite warriors, accustomed to the heat and barren terrain, moved with agility, using guerrilla tactics to wear down the Roman forces. They were fast, stealthy, and adaptable, making them difficult to fight on unfamiliar ground. Unlike the Romans, who were out of their comfort zone, the Kushites seemed right at home in the vastness of the desert. Petronius quickly realized that the war would not be won by numerical superiority or tactics alone. The nature of the terrain and the logistical challenges were proving to be more complicated than he had ever imagined. At first, he believed that his victory at Penis would signal a decisive win, but he soon realized that, to defeat Kush, he would need not only strength, but also a strategic adaptation that took the environment's limitations into account. Rome's advantage was slowly fading, and the campaign was starting to seem harder than anyone had anticipated. The situation on the battlefield began to become unsustainable for the Romans. The army, already fatigued and worn out by the extreme conditions, knew that the war was turning into a stalemate. The Roman Empire, so accustomed to defeating its enemies on foreign soil, could not adapt to the relentless African desert. Difficulties were mounting, and options for Rome were rapidly narrowing. It was clear that something had to be done, or retreat might be the only solution. With the pressure on his troops mounting and the Kushite resistance growing fiercer, Petronius began to reconsider his options. The battlefield was becoming more than just a fight between two armies. It was a battle against the environment itself, a battle that Rome was not prepared to face in all its complexity. The decision to advance or retreat was becoming increasingly difficult. The tension was palpable, and Rome knew that its position in Egypt, and possibly its reputation, was at stake. The scorching heat of the desert and logistical difficulties had reached a critical point. Petronius, seeing his forces weakened by the heat, diseases, and lack of supplies, began to understand that continuing to advance would be an ever-growing risk. Each day, the Romans suffered more and more, and although the Kushites were still a threat, the terrain they were fighting on favored Candace's warriors, not the Romans. In a tense meeting with his commanders, Petronius did not hide the gravity of the situation. Losses were mounting, and the morale of the troops was at an all-time low. The Roman army, as disciplined and experienced as it was, could not win the war with military strength alone. The unfamiliar terrain and the challenges it imposed were pushing his troops to exhaustion. Petronius knew that continuing the fight would risk the integrity of his forces. The general, though proud and determined, recognized that continuing the campaign in the African desert would be an unsustainable endeavor. If he advanced further, his forces would be decimated, and Rome's reputation, already shaken, could be irreparably destroyed. Furthermore, the relentless resistance of the Kushites, who used guerrilla tactics to their advantage, made any advance slow and filled with risks. Roman victory seemed increasingly distant. It was then that Petronius made a difficult but pragmatic decision. He ordered the Roman troops to retreat. It would not be a flight, but a strategic withdrawal to avoid a total defeat. The retreat would allow the Roman army to regroup, resupply, and preserve what remained of its strength to face future challenges. Petronius, though aware that this action would be seen as a temporary defeat, knew it was necessary to avoid a far greater catastrophe. When he gave the order to withdraw, Petronius did not expect a battlefield victory, but the preservation of the empire. He also knew that this retreat did not mean the end of the war, but a pause, a chance to rethink strategies and reassess Rome's options for the future. The Romans were leaving Egypt, but they would not abandon it forever. The war against Kush was not over, but a new approach would be needed. Petronius, with his experience, understood that sometimes true military wisdom lies in knowing when to fight and equally when to withdraw. The retreat, however, was not without its challenges. The Kushites, despite being at an advantage, did not miss the opportunity to attack the retreating Romans. But even so, Petronius managed to keep his forces organized. During the journey back, he captured Kushite prisoners, and in an attempt to restore Roman honor, he brought them back to Rome as trophies. It was a partial victory, but a victory of image, which in some way eased the pain of the defeat on the battlefield. In Rome, the news of Petronius's retreat was met with a mix of disappointment and caution. Although the empire had not been completely defeated, Roman pride had taken a blow. News of Kush's fierce resistance and Candace's unyielding struggle spread quickly, and Rome knew that the war in Egypt was far from resolved. Petronius, upon returning to the capital, brought with him a bitter lesson. Sometimes, the survival of an empire does not depend on winning every battle, but on the ability to learn from mistakes and adapt to constantly changing circumstances. Petronius' withdrawal wasn't the end of the story, but rather a pause. The future of Rome in Egypt and its relationship with Kush were far from being decided. The big questions still lingered. What would Rome do next to ensure its authority in the region? Petronius knew that his decision to retreat would carry significant weight. Upon returning to Rome, he prepared to face the bitter responsibility of reporting his failed campaign to Augustus. It wouldn't be an easy report. The Roman emperor had a sharp eye for his general's mistakes, and a defeat, even a strategic one, could tarnish Rome's image. However, Petronius knew that honesty was the only way to handle the situation transparently. When presenting his report to Augustus, the general was meticulous in explaining every detail of the hardships faced in the African desert. He described in frankness the extreme conditions, the relentless heat that drained the Roman forces, the diseases that decimated his men, and the Kushites' superior ability to use the terrain to their advantage. Petronius emphasized how Candace's forces were adapted to the region, while Rome was completely unprepared for the challenge. He explained, without hesitation, that fighting against Kush wasn't a simple military confrontation, but a battle against a hostile environment that seemed more like an enemy than a battlefield. Although Petronius reported the accomplishments of the Roman troops, he didn't shy away from acknowledging their failures. He detailed the fierce resistance from the Kushites and how the expectation of a swift victory evaporated as difficulties increased. He succinctly mentioned the need for a strategic withdrawal to preserve what remained of his forces and ensure the survival of the army. Even in an empire accustomed to overwhelming victories, the general knew that prudence could be more valuable than blind stubbornness. Upon concluding his report, Petronius didn't apologize, but instead offered a pragmatic outlook on the future. The war against Kush was not lost, but a rethinking of the approach was necessary. He suggested that Rome needed a new understanding of the territory, a deeper strategic adaptation, perhaps with a focus on negotiation, or at least a more flexible approach. He also emphasized that, unlike usual military campaigns, the conquest of the Kingdom of Kush wouldn't be simple. Rome would need to reconsider the nature of this war. Augustus listened attentively to Petronius' report, his piercing gaze fixed on the general. The emperor, known for his astuteness and political skill, understood that not every war could be won through brute force. He had no intention of punishing Petronius immediately. On the contrary, he understood the limitations of the campaign and the wisdom of retreating to save the Roman army from a greater disaster. However, one thing was clear to Augustus. Rome could not afford to let the humiliation in Egypt be seen as a sign of weakness. In his response, Augustus acknowledged the difficulties faced by Petronius and his troops, but was emphatic in warning that a defeat in Egypt could have repercussions beyond the empire's borders. He highlighted that losing control of Egypt could not be considered a viable option, given the region's importance to Rome, especially for grain supply and other vital resources. A Roman defeat should not be a possibility, and the empire needed to reclaim its authority over Egypt. Although Petronius' report was detailed and careful, the pressure on him did not lessen. Augustus, as emperor, had the vision that Rome needed to maintain its reputation as an unbeatable power, and that would require decisive action. The solution, according to Augustus, was clear. Rome would need to send more forces and try again to regain control, but this time with a more strategic approach, possibly using a combination of military force and diplomacy. The outcome of this meeting was a reinforcement of the troops and a revision of Rome's strategies. Augustus did not ignore Candace's resistance nor the difficulties that Petronius had faced, but he made it clear that the withdrawal could not be seen as a definitive failure, but rather as an opportunity to adjust the Roman approach to the situation. History was far from being written, and there was still much to be decided about the future of Egypt and the Kingdom of Kush. While Rome reorganized to launch a new expedition against the Kingdom of Kush, Candace, the warrior queen, did not rest. She knew that the Roman retreat didn't mean victory, but a strategic pause. Seizing the golden opportunity to consolidate her forces, Candace summoned a meeting with her generals and tribal leaders, strategizing to strengthen Kush's resistance and secure her nation's independence against the imperial power. The victory over the Romans, even if partial, had boosted the morale of the Kushite warriors. They were now more confident and motivated than ever, having witnessed the failure of Roman power against the bravery and cunning of their enemies. Candace knew that her army's true strength didn't just come from weapons, but from the determination and fighting spirit of her people. It was essential that morale remained high, and that confidence in their leader remained at its peak. In her palace, Candace welcomed ambassadors from various tribes of the African desert, each offering support. They knew that the Kingdom of Kush couldn't face the Roman Empire alone, and the tribes from the south and west were willing to help in the fight. She knew that to face Rome, the unity of forces was essential. These tribes, which had previously been hostile or distrustful of Kush, now saw the queen as the defender of freedom against Roman tyranny. With the support of these tribes, Candace not only expanded her army, but also diversified her tactics. Each tribe brought with them different combat skills, techniques, and regional knowledge. Some, accustomed to life in the desert, brought guerrilla warfare and ambush techniques. Others, more focused on frontal battles, prepared their warriors to face the Romans in more organized engagements. This fusion of combat styles was a crucial advantage. At the same time, Candace realized that she couldn't rely solely on military strength to ensure Kush's survival. She also needed diplomatic wisdom. She sent emissaries to other powers in the region, including kingdoms in Africa, and even some tribes from northern Arabia, who could provide strategic support or neutralize potential Roman allies. Candace was a multifaceted leader, capable of leading in battle, but also negotiating with skill. Her intelligence and political vision transformed Kush into a more unified and powerful force. For Rome, the strengthening of Kush seemed like a rising nightmare. The withdrawal of Roman troops had not been just a temporary relief, but an opportunity for the Kushites to prepare better. Rome, which had relied on its military superiority, had underestimated Candace's determination and her people's ability to reorganize. The resistance of Kush, now more robust than ever, threatened to make any new Roman incursion an even more difficult and risky task. Candace, for her part, understood the gravity of what was at stake. She knew that the war against Rome would be long and would require all her forces, both military and political. But she also knew that what was being built in Kush was not just an army, but a nation united and determined to protect its freedom. Every step she took toward organizing her kingdom and unifying the African tribes was a clear demonstration that, despite Rome's power, Kush's fate would not be decided by Rome, but by the Kushites themselves. The queen now had more than just an army. She had a coalition of peoples determined to oppose imperial rule. And this would be a much harder adversary to defeat. Rome, still reeling from the humiliation in its Egyptian lands, knew it could not allow the Kingdom of Kush to remain an unanswered threat. Emperor Augustus, aware of the impact of victory by the Kushites could have on the empire's image, decided to act swiftly. A new expedition was organized with the clear goal of regaining control over Egypt and finally suppressing Candace's resistance. This would be a mission to reaffirm Rome's power, and nothing would be left to chance. Petronius, the successful commander of the first expedition, was called back to lead the Roman forces again. The general knew that this time he would need to prepare for what would be a much tougher campaign. The Kushites, after their partial victory, were no longer unprepared. On the contrary, they had reorganized, strengthened their forces, and adapted to the terrain much more efficiently. Moreover, the growing number of tribes supporting Candace made any incursion into enemy territory an extremely risky mission. The Roman expeditionary force, composed of 10,000 soldiers, was carefully recruited and trained to face a larger and fiercer army. Rome, though facing difficulties, would not miss the opportunity to retake Egypt and avenge its previous defeat. The legions were in high spirits, equipped with the best that the empire could offer. However, Petronius knew that the terrain in southern Egypt would be one of the greatest challenges, especially after the lessons learned from the first campaign, where the relentless heat and lack of supplies had been the biggest obstacles. As the Roman troops marched toward the heart of Kushite territory, Petronius couldn't help but reflect on the challenges ahead. Candace's forces, now well-trained and prepared, were everywhere in Egyptian territory, ready to strike at any moment. He knew that the war would not only be fought with swords and spears, but with cunning, strategies, and tight control of the terrain. The desert terrain, where the Romans were inexperienced, favored the Kushites and their guerrilla tactics. Along the way, Petronius began to realize that, while Rome dominated vast territories by military force, the Kushites were learning to fight in a more intimate, fiercer way, focused on the intelligent use of their environment. Rome's approach did not go unnoticed. Candace, always alert to enemy movements, quickly prepared for the inevitable battle. Her alliance with other African tribes was solidifying, and the number of Kushite warriors was growing. Her strategy was simple but effective. Instead of confronting Rome in a head-on battle where their numbers could still be surpassed, she decided to use tactics like ambushes, swift strikes, and strategic withdrawals. Candace was confident that her mobility and knowledge of the land would give her the advantage. But Rome was determined to stay focused on the objective. Petronius' legions pressed on relentlessly, advancing through the hot and unforgiving desert, with horses exhausted and men fatigued. The search for resources, food, and water became increasingly difficult, and the Romans began to realize that Kushite territory wasn't just a place of resistance, but a natural trap for any army unprepared for the conditions. As the Roman troops neared the Kushite lines, the tension grew. The Kushites, aware of their advantage on the terrain, were ready to fight, and Rome knew that every step forward was an opportunity for more difficulties, higher costs, and more losses. What was at stake now wasn't just Egypt's survival, but the reaffirmation of Roman power in Africa, and the Roman Empire, with its vast war machine, was unwilling to fail again. Thus, the war between Rome and Kush intensified, with each side preparing for the final clash that could determine the fate of the region. As Roman forces approached the Kushite border, the situation for Rome seemed increasingly tense. Petronius knew that this time the challenge would be much greater. Candace's army, strengthened by alliances with neighboring tribes and months of meticulous preparations, was no longer the same as before. Now the Kushite army was a well-oiled war machine, in tune with the land and its own forces. Candace had managed to unite the African tribes under her banner, and her army was growing both in numbers and skill. The tribes that had initially hesitated to join Kush were now committed. They brought their own warriors, each with their own specialties. Some were masters of combat in rugged and desert terrains. Others were exceptional archers, able to shoot arrows with deadly precision. Some Kushite soldiers specialized in night attacks, using darkness as cover for their swift ambushes. Candace's army was now immensely diverse and prepared to use the terrain to their advantage, a skill that Rome could never easily master. Candace, in her wise leadership, knew that her army could not just rely on numbers. She was fully aware that Rome had a well-trained army, with superior weaponry and equipment. So, the solution wasn't to challenge Rome in a direct confrontation, but to exploit their weaknesses. The Roman legions were used to organized battle in the front line, but the unpredictable nature of Kush, with its vast sand dunes, dense vegetation, and hidden roads, was a natural labyrinth where Rome, despite its military discipline, had no advantage. Instead of marching directly to meet Petronius, Candace chose to attack the Roman supply lines. She knew that without enough food and resources, the Roman army would be unable to fight effectively. Thus, Kushite forces began attacking small Roman detachments, destroying outposts and disrupting the supply of water and food. This type of guerrilla tactic began to have a real impact on Rome. Petronius' troops, used to taking cities and defeating enemies in quicker and more decisive battles, were now facing a prolonged and exhausting struggle. Roman morale began to waver as the heat of the desert and the unpredictable attacks of the Kushites weakened the troops. Many Romans began to question the value of fighting for a land that seemed distant, without the necessary resources to sustain a prolonged battle. But Candace, on the other hand, was at her best. She understood the rhythm of war and knew that time was on her side. Her army moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, while the Roman army began to drag, tired and without the same momentum as in the first campaign. Candace wasn't just a military leader, but also an unbeatable strategist. She knew when to retreat, when to attack, and most importantly, how to keep her soldiers motivated. Her ability to adapt on the battlefield and her charismatic leadership ensured that Kush's resistance became a growing force against Rome. She didn't see the war as just a matter of brute strength, but as a psychological game where resistance, cunning, and the control of time were the most powerful weapons. As Roman forces wore down and the siege of Egypt stretched on, the advantage was now clearly with Candace and her army. The fight against Rome was far from a simple battle of military power. It had turned into a fight for survival, for honor, and for the freedom of a people who had been underestimated, but were now ready to write their own story of resistance against the world's most powerful empire. While the Roman Empire dragged on through months of conflict, Emperor Augustus found himself facing a strategic dilemma. The fierce resistance of Candace and the growing power of Kush had turned into a nightmare for Rome. What had started as a mission to reclaim control of Egypt and crush a solitary resistance was turning into a costly and endless war. The campaign, which had initially seemed like a simple suppression, had become a test of endurance for both sides. Augustus, always a shrewd strategist, began to realize that the cost of war was outweighing the potential benefits. The Roman army was being weakened, losses were mounting, and the fight in the desert seemed to be going nowhere. Furthermore, Rome's resources were being exhausted, with the war consuming more than could be sustained in the long term. Instead of triumphing, Rome was beginning to be dragged into a conflict that appeared to have no end in sight. It was then that Augustus made a crucial decision. He recognized that Rome's long-term strategy of expansion needed to be revised. The conquest of Egypt, while important, no longer justified the immense sacrifices and costs of the war against Kush. The emperor, thinking in broader terms of preserving the empire, decided that the best option was to seek a diplomatic solution, a negotiation that would guarantee peace without further Roman bloodshed. The decision to withdraw Roman forces from the region and pave the way for peace with the Kingdom of Kush became the pragmatic and sensible solution. With his decision, Augustus initiated a withdrawal of troops and began a negotiation process with Candace. He knew that, although it would be seen as a failure, this move would demonstrate a more realistic and strategic vision of the empire, something more sustainable for the future. The Kushite resistance and Candace's ability to keep her land free from the Romans had forced Rome to retreat, and the empire would have to accept this new reality. Candace's victory over Rome was not just a matter of military strength, but a strategic victory in the diplomatic arena. When the negotiations began, she knew she no longer had to prove the strength of her army. Rome was already aware of her capacity for resistance and the high cost the conflict had come to represent. Candace, with her political intelligence and clear vision of what was necessary to secure her people's freedom, used this advantage to negotiate peace on favorable terms. Rome, though wounded in its imperial pride, had to acknowledge that the continued resistance of Kush could not be broken without further compromising resources and Roman lives. The revocation of previously imposed tributes was one of Candace's first victories in the negotiations. She not only secured Kush's total independence, but also obtained economic concessions that benefited her kingdom. With the end of the war, the Kingdom of Kush flourished, as, without the heavy Roman taxes, its economy had the freedom to grow without the constraints of imperial domination. The peace was not only a military or economic victory, but also a significant symbolic triumph for Candace and her people. Rome, until then unbeatable on many fronts, had to accept that it had found an adversary capable of resisting its expansionist will. Candace, with her shrewd diplomacy and resolute leadership, became a respected figure not just in Kush, but throughout the known world. She had challenged the greatest empire of the time and emerged victorious, not through the strength of the sword, but through the power of intelligence and courage. Rome's defeat at the hands of Kush had a profound and lasting impact on the history of the empire. While it wasn't a total military defeat, the withdrawal of Roman troops and the recognition of Kush's independence represented a symbolic blow to Rome, a nation that prided itself on its immense strength and conquering ability. For many, the fact that Rome had been forced to retreat before a kingdom considered exotic and inferior was a shock. The story of invincible Rome was beginning to be questioned. This event caused Roman leaders to reconsider their expansion strategies. The idea that Rome could simply subdue any people or territory to its will began to be challenged. Candace's victory and the resistance of Kush served as a reminder that Roman domination was not guaranteed, and that the empire, as powerful as it was, also had its limits. This reflection led to a shift in Rome's focus, as it began to direct more energy toward maintaining its already conquered borders, rather than incessantly seeking to expand its domain. Moreover, the defeat in Kush brought to light a valuable lesson for Rome: the importance of adaptation and understanding local cultures. The Roman Empire, often so focused on imposing its own order and values, learned the hard way that the resistance of peoples who knew their own terrain, cultures, and military tactics could pose an even greater challenge than any Roman army could anticipate. This lesson about the limits of imperial power would become a recurring theme in future Roman campaigns. The impact of Candace's victory over Rome was a historic milestone that endured for generations. She became a symbol of resistance, not only for the Kingdom of Kush, but also for other civilizations around the world. Her ability to unite diverse tribes, her strategic leadership, and her diplomatic skill became part of the legends that would echo throughout history. Candace didn't just win a battle, she defied an empire that seemed invincible, showing that with determination and intelligence, even the greatest challenges could be overcome. Her figure became an icon of female leadership in an era where power was almost exclusively in the hands of men. Her resistance to Rome was not just a military victory, but an affirmation of women's power in the political and military arena. She inspired not only the women of her own kingdom, but also other leaders and warriors around the world. Unlike traditional historical figures, Candace didn't just follow the paths of her predecessors. She carved her own way, with a mix of courage, cunning, and a deep love for her people. Candace's legacy continued to be revered for centuries after her victory. Her name became associated with the independence and strength of a people who defied the expectations of the ancient world. She not only secured her kingdom's freedom, but she also reinforced the idea that a leader's true strength doesn't lie just in the ability to fight, but in the ability to understand, negotiate, and lead with vision and courage. This legacy, though sometimes forgotten in the dominant narratives of ancient history, always thrived in cultures that celebrate resistance against oppression and the value of intelligent leadership. After the Roman forces withdrew and Kush's independence was recognized, the kingdom entered an era of stability and prosperity. Free from the heavy impositions of the Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Kush was able to consolidate its power and expand its borders. The victory over Rome not only guaranteed its freedom, but also reaffirmed Kush's strategic importance in Africa. Candace, with her unbeatable leadership, maintained control over the territories and continued to strengthen her position, seeking alliances with other local powers and expanding trade across the region. The impact of Candace's victory was also felt in Kush's economy. Without the restrictions imposed by Rome, trade flourished. The kingdom, located in a region rich in natural resources, began trading with other African kingdoms and consolidating its relationship with Egypt. The grains, gold, wood, and other precious goods available in Kush became even more valuable. The economic prosperity helped strengthen military power and establish a solid foundation for the future, keeping the kingdom safe from external invasions. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire, while still maintaining much of its domination over other regions, never forgot the shock it suffered in Africa. The Kingdom of Kush, now stronger than ever, became a living example that even the most powerful empires can be challenged. Over the years, Kush continued to expand and prosper, and its story of resistance and victory against Rome remained engraved in the collective imagination as a symbol of strength and freedom. The Kushite Empire was a respected power in Africa for centuries after the conflict, maintaining its independence and influence. The battle between Rome and Kush became a classic example of resistance against imperial oppression. Over the centuries, the story of this confrontation was told and retold, not just as a simple war between two empires, but as a symbol of the fight for independence and self-determination. The people of Kush, under the brilliant leadership of Candace, showed the world that even an empire as vast and powerful as Rome could be challenged with courage, intelligence, and unity. What began as a simple resistance to an oppressive tribute turned into a fight for freedom, something that reverberated in many other cultures and civilizations throughout history. Kush's confrontation with Rome also became an important lesson for future generations of leaders and strategists. Candace's victory wasn't just over an empire, but over the idea that absolute, unquestionable power is an illusion. Rome, which had dominated vast regions for centuries, saw its limitations exposed, and the world witnessed that even the greatest armies can be defeated, not just through military strength, but through the ability to lead with wisdom. The story of Kush, then, became a tale of strategic and diplomatic resistance, something that would inspire future independence movements in various parts of the world. The narrative of Kush resisting the Roman Empire was further echoed in literature, the arts, and education. The figure of Candace became an icon of female leadership, inspiring women to take on roles of power and influence in their own societies. The courage of the people of Kush continued to be remembered as a beacon of hope for those who found themselves oppressed or subjugated by larger, more powerful empires. The story of their victory over Rome, with its blend of bravery and diplomacy, became studied worldwide as an example that, in the end, the true strength of a people lies in their ability to resist and remain true to their own values and freedom. To wrap up today's video, it's clear that the story of Candace and the Kingdom of Kush teaches us valuable lessons about resistance, leadership, and the fight for freedom. A determined people can, indeed, challenge even the greatest empires, and this story continues to inspire to this day. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave your comment below. We'd love to hear what you think about this incredible battle and Candace's legacy. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos, where we'll continue exploring the fascinating stories of the ancient world. Don't forget to like and share with your friends. See you next time.